Hey guys and gals, it's your buddy Drew with Living History's Mysteries and Ferocious Feline Productions. You know, of all the things we talk about on this channel, one of the most popular subjects are the Vikings, the Norse, the Northmen. To start off 2025, I wanted to stay away from the mainstream accounts of history and actually go to the source. Today, we're going to take a look and a listen to some of the history of Sweden and the Northmen from a Northman himself. And a lot of the details he gives might just be a shock. Check this out. This is good.
To begin with, I thought it would be a good idea to talk a bit about Viking mentality, because this is something that will reappear even after the Viking Age has ended, and that is the quest for glory. And I stand here beside a glorious runestone, and I will talk a bit about the purpose of a runestone. And to explain both the purpose of a runestone and the Viking mentality is with a quote from Havamal, which goes as follows: "Kettle die and kinsmen die, and one day you will also die. But there is one thing I know which never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds." And that is exactly what a runestone is. It is a commemoration raised by someone's sons, someone's relatives, someone's friends to commemorate a heroic and glorious deed. So the Viking mentality was, to a large extent, about gaining that fame, gaining that glory in the eyes of one's peers. So it was important to live a life that could be held up as a model to others, that could inspire the next generation to greatness. And we also have to talk a bit about what glory is. Glory can be said to be respect earned among the men of your tribe or among the men of other tribes. It's about doing something daring, something courageous, something beyond the ordinary. That is one interpretation of the metaphysical value of glory. The Vikings were primarily out of two things, gold and glory. The gold part is quite easy to understand. Raiding and trading was the lifeblood of the Vikings. But also the glory aspect, and that can explain the adventures they partook in, both west and eastwards. So that is basically what a runestone is. It's about someone who has lived a glorious life, a glorious enough life so that it will be told to others even after he is dead. So that is the fame of a dead man's deeds. You have runestones to commemorate it. Now, if we're talking a bit about the Viking expansions, we have to look upon the geography of Scandinavia. Back during the Viking Age, most of Scandinavia was forest, so you couldn't really get all too easily to other parts via land. But going to other places with ships was much easier. So if we look upon the connections of that time, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland were much more connected via the coasts. So if we look upon which Vikings went where, primarily Vikings from western Sweden, Denmark and Norway went west, whereas the Vikings from the eastern coast of Sweden went east down to Constantinople, also known as Miklagård. Now we will go to another rune stone, which is erected in the memory of someone who went west with the Danish king to take Danageld tribute in England. Now, of course, the Vikings who went east didn't only raid and trade or join the Varangian Guard to fight for the Byzantine Emperor. Some of them established kingdoms. The most notable example is the name Russia, which comes from Roslagen, which is the area I am in at the moment. So eastern coast of Sweden in Uppland, Roslagen. And from there you derive the name of the Rus, which in turn became Russia, although the Viking ruling class of Novgorod and the Russian kingdoms soon became assimilated by the larger Slavic populations. So behind me stands one of two runestones raised in the memory of a man called Ulfric, who went to England to bring back 2 Danagelds, which is the tribute the English paid the Vikings to get off their land, basically. Now, of course, as we will discuss later on in another episode, Canute the Great, the Danish king, created a North Sea empire, and his influence was felt even here in Sweden. And again, if we're talking about the geography of Scandinavia, if you wonder why a rune stone is placed here, quite far from both Denmark and England, but in terms of actual time of transportation, it was quite near, considering the sea roads were so effectively used by the Vikings. So when we're gauging communications and distances, it needs to be viewed from the point of ships. And then also, if we're talking about Denmark, which would later become, along with Russia, Sweden's greatest enemy, back in the day there wasn't really much of a difference between Norwegians, Danes and Swedes. And for those who are wondering, I can't understand Danish. I can speak Norwegian, or rather I can speak Swedish to Norwegians and they can speak back Norwegian to me, and I can understand. Back in the Viking age we could understand each other perfectly, because then as I said again, the connections were via the coasts rather than the actual land. So the cultural exchange, we were much more similar back then, so there wasn't really Denmark and Sweden as you would see later on in history. So that can explain why Swedish, or rather Vikings located in today's Sweden, went with Danish kings, and also Danes and Norwegians went with Swedish ships onto the lands in the east. Vikings were very much indeed occupied with the quest for glory, the quest for fame and riches and conquest. Greetings, and thus far we are still in the good old pagan times. The reason I am here in Uppsala today is to talk about a few different things. First and foremost, the religion of ancient or old Scandinavia, which of course is Nordic paganism, and Uppsala was a capital of sorts in regards to paganism. So behind me we see 3 different hills, or not hills, rather grave mounds, where mighty chieftains are buried. And before I talk more about them, I'd like to again talk a bit about the geography of Sweden, or the geography of Scandinavia. In the last episode I explained the importance of the sea lanes. The coasts were what connected the different parts of Scandinavia, so Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the coast of Finland, etc. If we're looking upon what was to later become Sweden, we have 2 parts. We have Svealand, where the main territory is Uppland, where we are right now, so Uppsala in Uppland. The other territory, Götaland, was the perhaps more civilized and advanced part of Sweden. And if we're gonna translate Svear and Götar to English, it could be translated as Swedes from Svealand and Goths from Götaland. And of course, the Gothic people do not need any further introduction. They left their mark and perhaps one could argue made Europe a more beautiful place, genetically speaking. But either way, in terms of Svealand and Uppland, this was the center of this part of Sweden before the two places were connected. As I said, the forests were deep, dark and impregnable, so Götaland and Svealand were separated by two great forests, Tiveden and Kolmården. So in this part of Sweden, Uppsala had a preeminent role as a religious and civic center. Now, of course, we don't know all too much about this time, because not all too much is being written down. But we know that Uppsala served as a place of worship and as a center for the powers to be in Uppland. So, behind me, as I said, we have three glorious mounds, and they are known as the King's Mounds here in Gamla Uppsala, means Old Uppsala, and some have speculated that they are raised for the three gods, Odin, Thor and Frey, all primary deities in the pre-Christian religion of the North. But Uppsala had a great role for the pagan community around Svealand. So people would gather here to perform blots, sacrifices, and to partake in games, etc. So again, an important part for the social cohesion of this part of Sweden. So now we will head on to another earlier grave. It might actually be a good idea to elaborate briefly upon the migration era where the Gothic peoples, along with other Germanic tribes, wandered down to claim kingdoms of their own. So as most of you know, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes went to the British Isles to stake out kingdoms there. The Franks went into today's France to, well, create France. And the Gothic peoples went first into Eastern Europe, where they stayed for a while, but then as the Huns began to appear in the east, they started pushing west. So the Visigoths, West Goths, conquered Iberia, and the Ostrogoths, East Goths, conquered the Italian peninsula. Now I am at Valsgärde, just north of Gamla Uppsala, Old Uppsala, at another grave field. And these graves are dating back to the earliest of them, back to the 500s and 600s AD. And there has been some graves, boat graves, and something very interesting here that proves how connected still this part of Sweden was with the rest of the world is that some of the chieftains have been buried, and Uppsala University made some archaeological excavations here about 8 years ago, and they found silk garments that were quite well preserved on these chieftains, and the silk came from Sogdiana, a area east of the Caspian Sea, and also from China. So it's quite cool to see even back then how far these luxury goods could travel. So yes, Valsgärde right here, epic place. And now we'll go to Kung Björns hög. Now I am located on the other side of Uppsala, and we are at Kung Björns hög. Kung means king. Björn is a Swedish men's name, which also means bear. So King Bear, King Björn's grave, also known as Håga Högen. So this is a grave mound dating to the Bronze Age, actually. So we're traveling further back in time than the Viking Age. And this grave that you see behind me right here is the grave that is the richest in gold in all of Scandinavia from the Bronze Age. So as I said in the last episode, all Norsemen, regardless of time era, have a certain affinity for gold and silver. So yes, a lot of gold has been found here, and gold did not only signify material wealth, it also had a spiritual aspect to it. So gold, a noble metal, of course. The story of Sweden's Christianization begins here in Birka, a few miles west of Stockholm. Birka was a prosperous trading town during the 700s up till the late 900s. From here came wares from all over Europe, including Russia, and even from destinations further away. As I mentioned in the previous video, silk from Sogdiana in China has been found in Uppsala, and Birka was indeed well situated, geographically speaking, to bring wares to Uppsala. Birka was the principal trading town in Svealand, whereas Uppsala was the religious and civic center. The most important exports from Birka, and thus Svealand, Sweden in general, were iron and furs. From the countries across the Baltic Sea came fine goods such as honey, beeswax and linens, and the import of linen garments from the Baltic is a fine tradition that I endeavor to reignite. And a large and important part of the imports that came into Birka came from the powerful Frankish Empire to the south. Understanding Europe during the 800s is to a large part understanding the Frankish Empire. As I mentioned, in the Great Germanic Migration era had created numerous new kingdoms all over Europe. The most powerful kingdom, or rather empire, would become the Frankish one. The Frankish Empire, at the height of its power, encompassed large parts of France and Germany, and even more lands, as can be seen by this map. The reason for discussing the Frankish Empire when talking about Sweden's Christianization is because the influence of Christianity came from two major sources, the British one and the Frankish one. And if you wonder why the story begins here in Birka almost 200 years before Sweden became Christian, it's because it was here the Frankish missionary Ansgar first landed during the 800s. He did create a church that was active for a few years, but ultimately it was abandoned, and it would be another 200 years until Sweden began its Christianization process. Although Sweden didn't become Christian overnight, it was a gradual process over the entire Middle Ages, and many pagan beliefs, just as in most of Europe, clinged on and took the shape of Catholic holidays, for example. So, even though Ansgar failed to bring Christianity to Sweden, Sweden became Christian eventually. And the question is, how did Sweden become Christian? Why did Sweden become Christian? And it's actually a matter more of politics rather than spirituality. As the Viking Age draw to its conclusion, if you will, the Vikings or the Scandinavians got tighter connections to England and Germany and the great empires of the continent. The Vikings also realized that the Christian kingdoms were quite powerful indeed. So one could argue that it's actually the powerful aspect of Christianity that was appealing to the Vikings here in Sweden, for example. And a difference between how the various Nordic countries become Christian differs a bit. So in Norway you had the quite brutal king Olav, who took the sword to anyone who didn't want to become Christian, basically. And if we're talking about Christianity as a state religion, it is a better option for a ruler, for a centralized king, than paganism is, just based upon the teachings of Christianity versus paganism, where paganism is a bit more suited to someone who's wild, people that is wild, a bit more chaotic, whereas if you want to cement a kingdom, if you want to create a kingdom where everything is a bit more centralized, you have a king who is chosen by God himself, it's easier to rule a bit more calm people, so to speak. So in Norway it was a bloody and dramatic affair. In Sweden it was more or less to do with trade and connections to the continent. So Birka, for example, where we are, a central hub of trade, both east primarily to the Viking colonies in Russia, for example, but also to all of the Baltic. So Christianity was a good choice for Swedes to adapt, to get closer to the continent culturally and spiritually. So it was a good deal. It was a good deal to get on the winning team, so to speak. So the pagan world was a bit outdated. The new, modern, powerful was on the continent, and the continent was Christian. So it might have been a case that they looked towards England with its advanced statecraft. They looked towards France or the Frankish kingdom, or to Germany, saw the majestic cathedrals, churches, and heavy knights, and so that is the way to go. This white Christ is a powerful entity. We need to adapt his ways. And also, if we're talking about polytheism, if you have many gods, it's easier to adopt yet another god who is quite similar to Balder. So if you have this white Christ, it might be a good idea to have him on your side. And if you already have 8 or so gods or 3 main deities, and then you want to add in another god whose disciples and whose kingdoms are so powerful, why take the chance to not go with that god as well? So that could be another aspect seen from a religious point of view why the Swedish Vikings adapted Christianity. But my analysis, and I'm hardly the first one to present this, is that it was probably mostly to do with a way to get closer in terms of trade, in terms of cultural exchange, in terms of getting to the same power level as the other kingdoms on the continent and in Denmark, for example. So 200 years earlier, when Ansgar was here, the kingdoms of the continent in England, they weren't as prepared to face off against the Viking raiders. But 200 years later, as we draw up to the 11th century, they were a bit more used to it. They had better military capacity to fight off Viking invaders. So Sweden, for example, had to adapt to it. So that could be said to be the reason for Sweden becoming Christian. Then I'm sure there are plenty of different explanations as to why this happened. But for a king who's out for power, it made perfect sense. The different nations in Europe dealt with the Vikings in different manners. A notable example is how the Frankish king dealt with the Vikings. He invited the Normans, or the people who would become the Normans, he invited their king Rollo and said, you can have this land as long as you defend it against other Vikings. Now, of course, the Normans, as most of you know, went on to even further conquests, most primarily the throne of England in perhaps the most well-known battle of all time, the Battle of Hastings, 1066. They also conquered Sicily and was a quite aggressive and brutal people in general. And today I thought to talk a bit about the Crusades from a Scandinavian perspective. Near to here we have a runestone erected in the memory of Östen, who went to Jerusalem, Jursalir, for a pilgrimage and died in Greece, Greekland, in the Byzantine Empire. And although Sweden's primary target for its holy wrath went east to Finland, the Baltics, and Russia, there was also a contingent who went down to fight in the Holy Land along the Crusaders. The most famous one is actually a fictive character called On, and for the record, one of the greatest reading experiences I've had was when I was 13 and read the trilogy of On, the Templar by Jan Guillou. Now, of course, I might have had a different opinion on the series if I read it today, but then it was a really inspiring series that really got me interested in history. Now, you might wonder, why would Swedish or Scandinavian crusaders go with Germans, Englishmen, Frenchmen to retake the Holy Land? Well, as I said, it was still the allure of gold and glory, in addition to, of course, geopolitical and religious reasons. So if we're talking about the religious reasons, you could get absolved of sins if you partook in a crusade. But a great reason, in my opinion at least, and I'm not the first one to say this, is that there was the promise of land, gold and glory to be had if you partook in a crusade. Now, of course, the majority of the fighting done by Scandinavians in the Middle East at the time was via the Varangian Guard, the elite regiment of the Byzantine Emperor, primarily made out of Scandinavian Vikings, but also of some Anglo-Saxons and some Slavic people. And a note here as well is that after William the Conqueror, the Norman, I talked about the Normans, when they took over England, a lot of Anglo-Saxons fled to the Byzantine Empire and became recruited in the Varangian Guard. So a lot of things were going on in medieval Europe, and of course the Crusades took place over numerous centuries, and the Crusades to Jerusalem were a bit earlier than the Crusades to the East. And the Crusades to the East, to Finland, was done for two reasons. If we believe the Christian or Swedish sources from the time, it was due to pagan aggression from the Finnish coast. So basically, Finnish Vikings raiding Sweden, Sweden retaliates via conquering Finland, and Christian argument to convert them to Christianity was of course used not only by the Swedish Crusaders at the time, but for other powers as well. What I just said is an oversimplification of the situation in Finland and Sweden at this time. The majority of people living along the coasts of Finland at this time were also Swedes. And when the Swedes of today's Sweden commenced their crusades against Finland, many of the Swedes and Finns who lived in Finland were already Christian. So you can imagine the awkward moment when they came to the other side of the Baltic Sea to convert people who were already good Christians. So this story is not black and white, but it has a lot of nuance to it. So I just thought to clarify that in the context of Swedish Crusades. And when we talk about Crusades, it is often a story of spirituality combined with geopolitical interests. So Sweden saw this as a great opportunity to expand eastward, which would later bring them into contact and conflict with Russia. Swedish Crusaders weren't the only ones who went east. You also had the infamous Teutonic Order, who waged a rather bloody crusade against the pagans in Lithuania, Lithuania being the country in Europe who stayed pagan the longest. So the Crusades weren't only conducted in order to meet Islamic aggression, although the Crusades were a very late response to Islamic aggression. If we're understanding the quest to retake the Holy Land, we must also discuss the general geopolitical situation in the Middle East at the time. The Roman Empire, and later the Byzantine Empire, had blooded itself against its longtime rival Persia. And when they had blooded themselves against each other for numerous centuries, a new aggressive and expansive power, namely the Arabs, who made huge land gains in formerly Persian territory and the formerly Christian North Africa. They also managed to conquer the formerly Visigothic Spain and Portugal, leaving one bit of Christian land in Asturias in north of the Iberian Peninsula. The Arabs got as far north as Tours, where they got resoundingly defeated by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732. So the Crusades was a very late response to Islamic aggression. Now the Crusades is a topic of its own, and I would need a much longer video to explain all of the details concerning those. But in regards to Sweden, it was also a way to participate in a greater Christian community. And of course, as I said, the allure of gold and glory and fame and recognition among the powers of Europe in the community of Christendom, so to speak. So that could be said to be the Swedish involvement in the Crusades, a minor contingent going with the larger Crusades instigated by the Pope and the larger powers. You had Crusades going eastwards for Sweden's own geopolitical reasons, for conquest, simply put. So that is the Swedish involvement in the Crusades, the very short story, one might say. I hope that was somewhat informative, and of course you can read up on all of this yourself, and I would definitely encourage you to read up more about the Crusades. Greetings. Today I thought to talk a bit about the origins of the knights, or the origins of the nobility. This is from a Swedish perspective, but it looked similar enough in the other European countries. So to understand the origins of the knights, we have to understand how the medieval combat scene looked at the beginning of the Middle Ages. Basically, the gold standard of violence, of warfare, of combat was a knight. And everyone knows what I mean when I say knight. We see before us a man in armor on a big horse, and he is equipped with a lance, a sword, a shield, etc. Now, of course, this was quite expensive to field. Not everyone had access to a horse because horses were expensive. Not everyone had access to an armor because armor was expensive. So what the king did, the Swedish king, he said to the richest farmers who could afford to become a killing machine, he said, you know what, you don't need to pay any taxes if you promise to fight for me as knights, because the king needed and wanted knights to both maintain his own order in the kingdom and also to compete with rival powers. So primarily against Denmark in Sweden's case, we needed knights to be able to compete with Danish knights, simply put. Now, of course, there were other means to defeat knights in guerrilla warfare. When Swedes did rebellions, they used crossbows and avoided pitched battles. But when it came to pitched battles in Europe at the time, during the Middle Ages, you needed to have heavy cavalry, knights, in your army. Then, of course, this didn't work as well against other powers, primarily the Mongols, who didn't fight in accord with European codes of chivalry at all. They used light cavalry and hit-and-run tactics. But usually the knights were the terror of the battlefields. Then there were some exceptions, of course. The most famous one is the Battle of Agincourt, where some English longbowmen defeated the creme de la creme of the French cavalry, the French knights. A most humiliating defeat for the French, but a victory still celebrated greatly in England today. It is worth pointing out that fighting from horseback was hardly anything new for Europeans, and fighting Mongol-like enemies wasn't anything new either, considering the terrors of the Hunnic invasion under Attila a few centuries earlier. Since we are on the topic of knights, it might be a good idea to briefly elaborate on the concept of chivalry. The knightly virtues of the Middle Ages came to evolve into chivalry, which basically means that you're supposed to be kind and humble despite being the pinnacle of violence. because if you're the pinnacle of violence without being moderated by any higher ideals, it might lead to oppression and ungodly behavior. So chivalry can only be achieved when you are strong and have the capacity for ultimate violence. If you do not have this, chivalry means absolutely nothing. So basically, the need for heavy cavalry, the need for the knight in the armies made these wealthy farmers or landholders, in Sweden's case, they made them the first nobility because they could afford to be knights, therefore they didn't need to pay any taxes. Now, of course, as the Middle Ages draw to its end and the gunpowder age came to be, you saw the perhaps greatest shift in how societies were built. Previously, during the Middle Ages, each knight, each lord, each feudal lord had greater autonomy over his particular land, whereas when the gunpowder came into the scene, castles became less powerful because cannons can reduce castles to rubble quite effectively. And also a knight was less effective when you had gunpowder, and at that time when countries and nations, the central power, so the king could start equipping more soldiers with gunpowder, knights lost their edge on the battlefield. And that's also when the kings could start centralizing their power more and more. So it went from being more autonomous out in the various parts of the country to more power going to the king. And in Sweden's case, it was certainly true, and in some other cases, France, for example, the local lords, the local dukes, etc., they had very much power as compared to the king, but this started to shift in the beginning of the early modern era. And as the early modern era progressed, the knights started to lose more and more influence, and eventually they lost their privileges as well, which is of course natural considering the fact that they didn't serve as the ultimate killing machines any longer. So anyway, that was the short version of the origin of the knights. Thank you for watching.
Welcome back. You know, it's like I was saying in the beginning. We go through all these mainstream sources of history to find information on things that really interest us. Sometimes it's nice to hit these individuals who aren't influenced by mainstream history or mainstream science for their information. What they tell is based on their own research, the information that they've gathered from other sources. There was a lot of information in this video, from the personalities to the wars to the individuals, even into the Crusades. I had no idea that Northmen fought in the Crusades. That was a little bit of a shock to me. What surprised you out of the information that was given in this video? Make sure and comment below and let us know what caught you off guard or what information surprised you. But that's all we've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of Sweden and the Northmen through history. Welcome to 2025, guys. This is like the, 11th, 12th? We're off to a good start. May 2025 be a blessing to each and every one of us in our own way. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. God bless you. God love you. We do. The skull.